Welcome to Roundhouse Crosstalk, a podcast hosted by the California State Railroad Museum. In this week's episode, we're going to be sitting down with Debbie Hollingsworth, our Interpreter 1 at the California State Railroad Museum, and somebody that worked on the Chinese Railroad Worker Experience exhibit. Which one was that released? When was that brought in?
It was released on the 150th anniversary of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, so that was in May of 2019.
Awesome. So we are getting close to its 5-year anniversary. That'll be next year. And you were the perfect person to talk to about the role of the Chinese railroad workers in the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. For listeners, we do have another podcast episode that dives into Theodore and Anna Judah's role in building the Transcontinental Railroad in our catalog. If you're interested, for this, we're mostly going to be talking about after Theodore and Anna Judah, and talking mostly about the actual building itself. But to give us a little bit of context on the Transcontinental Railroad, can you let our audience know what were the motivations to build the first Transcontinental Railroad?
Okay, well, first, I just want to say thank you for having me here. This is fun to be able to sit and talk about this topic. And I also wanted to say that the research that I've done is really based on the books written by Gordon Chang, Ghosts of Gold Mountain. Gordon Chang is a professor at Stanford University, and he and some other professors have been instrumental in doing a lot of research on the Chinese railroad workers with the Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project. So a lot of the information that I have has come from their material. And the wonderful book written by David Howard Bain, which is Empire Express, and it is a complete history of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad with the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific. So those are some really good resources that I have depended on, and if anybody out there wants to read any really good books about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, I would highly recommend those books. So that aside now, so the motivations for building the nation's first transcontinental railroad. Well, first of all, there was a wide network of railroads ever since the 1830s, all over the eastern part of the United States. So it joined the large cities together, the railroads joined those large cities together. But then as the nation moved westward, the desire for a Pacific Railroad became more and more profound. So the idea for the Transcontinental Railroad wasn't a new idea by the time it started to be built in the 1860s. As I said, it was an idea that was being kicked around since the 1840s. And as I said, that's because of the nation moving westward. Well, then this thing called the gold rush happened. And gold was discovered in California in 1848. And how to get to California was ridiculously hard. So there were three methods. One method would be if you were leaving from the eastern part of the United States, then you would take a ship and you'd go all the way down around the Horn, as they call it, the Horn, the tip of South America, and then all the way back up the western side and get to the United States or get to California that way. The other way would have been to take, as it would be, if you're taking a wagon train, that you would be walking across the continental United States to get there. And then in the 1850s, there was another route built through the Isthmus of Panama, so you could go that way. And all those routes were long, dangerous, and expensive. So if you're taking a ship around South America, or if you were walking across the country, that would take generally 4 to 6 months. And the Isthmus of Panama cut the route shorter by about a couple of months. But you're going through the jungles of Panama. It was not a very safe journey at all. So that's one of the reasons why people really needed to have a railroad to get to that far-off land of California, Oregon. And then, of course, with the Civil War happening, this was a great way that Lincoln saw of truly uniting the nation east and west. So during the Civil War, of course, the railroad didn't get started until after the Civil War, but that was one of the reasons to, and in fact, Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act in 1862, which was in the second year of the Civil War. So all those reasons, never a simple answer.
Yeah, absolutely. I always just get amazed at like they're going through a civil war, they're spending so much money on that, and yet they're still, diverting resources towards that war or the railroad just because of how important they must have saw it.
Yeah, and as I said, the idea of that Pacific Railroad had been kicked around for a long time. So what kept it from being built were political and sectional interests. So with the Civil War, that simplified things a lot because you didn't have the sectional interests of the South wanting to have a southern route. Just trying to agree on a route for the railroad was a lot. So it did make it a lot simpler, and that person that you mentioned before, Theodore Judah, was very instrumental in creating a plan for that railroad.
Absolutely. So jumping forward a little bit here, so now we know the motivations for the Transcontinental Railroad. We have a route which is going to be Sacramento to Omaha. Who eventually ends up working for this railroad, and why was there a labor shortage when we first got started?
Well, I think I kind of want to go back a little bit to Theodore Judah, even though you said that you have a podcast about him, because it's kind of hard to talk about building the railroad without at least mentioning him, because it was his dream to build the Transcontinental Railroad. It was the route that he planned starting in Sacramento and finding the route up and over the Sierra, and so building that sort of northern or central route for the railroad. He worked on the Sacramento Valley Railroad. That's what brought him to California. That was completed in 1856, and it was the first railroad west of the Mississippi. So to bring up that there was this railroad here, there were railroads in other parts of the country, and there were people working on those railroads, right? One of the amazing things about building the railroad is just thinking about how many people they needed to build it because it was all hand labor. It's one of the great engineering projects of all time for that reason. And if it's hand labor, that means you need a lot of workers. So Charles Crocker, who was the superintendent of building for the Central Pacific Railroad, and James Strobridge, who was the construction supervisor, they needed workers, and they advertised for 5,000 workers, and they could only retain between 600 to 800 at a time. When you think about that, 5,000 compared to just a few hundred. And these were primarily men of Irish descent, and they had a bit of a reputation for working until payday, and this is in the transcripts from James Strobridge saying they would get their paychecks, they would go out and get drunk, and then they would leave. They would go off and work in the mines. There was a lot of gold mining, silver mining in Nevada, so there were a lot of other temptations for people. So they just couldn't retain the workers. Building a railroad by hand is really hard work. So they would put out flyers, they would have newspaper articles advertising for workers, and they just couldn't hold on to the workers. They didn't know what to do.
Yeah, well, and that poses a problem because at the same time they're building the railroad, obviously you need a lot of people, but they're not just building this alone. They have other folks that are the Union Pacific, which is building on the other side. I'd imagine having a little bit easier of a time because there's more people on the East Coast that would potentially fill those roles. And every mile of track that the Union Pacific puts down is another mile of track that the Central Pacific
Exactly.
can't
It was
put
a
down.
race. But even the Union Pacific couldn't get workers until after the Civil War.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, they're all a little a little busy for a little while. Okay. Well, for the Central Pacific, how eventually do they solve this conundrum?
So, as I said, there were railroads built all over, and there were Chinese workers working on railroads in other parts of the country. So, it wasn't a new concept, but there were. So, Charles Crocker and James Strobridge, who I was just talking about, were having a little conversation about we really need workers here, and Charles Crocker suggested to Strobridge that he hire some Chinese workers and see how that works out. And Strobridge was dead set against it, in his own words, saying that it was his own prejudice that kept him from wanting to, he said, I will not boss the Chinese. And so, there are stories about whether what Crocker said or didn't say. A lot of people say, well, they built the Great Wall, didn't they? So why don't you give it a try? Whether that was really said or not, yeah, sure, that makes a lot of sense. And so they hired 50 workers and gave them some of just the easiest kind of work, just moving the fillers in the carts. And they worked hard, they were diligent, and they did the work. So Strobridge decided to hire 50 more, as the story goes, and 50 more and 50 more. And then finally, they just hired as many Chinese workers as they could find in the state of California, because a lot of the Chinese immigrants had been here because of the gold rush and were mining, and what they called California was Gold Mountain or Gumsan.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting sort of thing to touch on there. So they came originally for the gold rush, but for the most part, we don't see that same situation you were talking about earlier with the Irish workers, where they get their first paycheck and they go and they flee to mines or to go gold rushing or anything like that. So why did the Chinese railroad workers not end up doing that kind of stuff? Were there other forms of discrimination they were facing?
Well, the Chinese railroad workers faced a lot of discrimination ever since they came here. And, with the gold rush, initially in the gold rush, gold was very easy to find. And that was kind of the rumor that went out is, oh, it's just there for the picking. It's just in the streets. You could just pick up the gold. It really wasn't that easy by the time the gold rush started in earnest in 1849. It took a lot of hard work to find the gold. And because of that, and because there were so many Chinese immigrants here, doing the same as any other immigrant, wanting to find riches and go back home. Because of that, and because of this prejudice against them, California started the foreign miners tax. And the foreign miners tax, there were different iterations of it, but in 1852 there was a tax, and it would basically charge like $3 or $5 a month extra that you had to pay on top of that. So that's one form of discrimination. The Chinese workers would work really hard on, say, abandoned mine sites, and because they were willing to work so hard, they might come up successful. This created a lot of jealousy on the part of other miners. So they were there was a lot of violence perpetrated against them.
So going back, you mentioned that eventually the Central Pacific is hiring just about as many Chinese railroad workers as they can find within California. Eventually, even that's not enough, and they start looking directly to China for more of these laborers. Can you walk us through some of the push factors that were happening in China that would lead so many to, as you mentioned earlier, leave for the gold rush, and then eventually for the railroad as well?
Yeah, it's interesting because in this part of China, Guangdong province is where the majority of people came from. But it's just kind of a laundry list of everything that was going on in one place that you could consider a push factor, or a factor which might encourage people to leave their home to go somewhere else. So there was a lot of political upheaval. There was extreme poverty. There were floods and famine, overpopulation. There was a corrupt imperial government and secret societies, and then finally just this all-out civil war. It was located near Hong Kong, so it made it a lot easier for people to leave and get on a ship and travel across the ocean to the United States or to other countries. So one statistic I found in Gordon Chang's book that was from 1860 to 1874, more than 112,000 Chinese left from Hong Kong for the United States. And they all arrived through San Francisco at that time. So, just numbers like that gives an idea of why they left their their homes to either make money in the gold rush or to earn money with the railroad. And then it was their plan to return, but they sent that money back home to support their families in their home villages.
Yeah, and that's something that, I mean, we still see today with immigrant communities typically is that, and I can't remember the word for it, it starts with an R. It's like, what is it? It's essentially the process of sending that money home. So you make the money in the country that you immigrated to, and then you send it back to your family that is in the place that you left. Do you know anything about that system? Like how, I'm thinking like today that's a lot easier. There's banks and it's all, digital, numbers at this point that we can just send from account to account and things like that. But I'd imagine it'd be a lot more difficult back in the 1800s.
Well, they insisted on being paid in gold, and the Chinese, they went through companies that would, if they didn't have the money for passage, so then they would get paid, they would pay off the contracting company until they completely paid off their ticket. And then that money was sent back to China. But one other point that I wanted to make, because it does come up a lot, is the issue of slave labor, or as they were called, coolies, which was a derogatory term. And I want to make the point that the men that left China, first of all, to come work on the railroad, they came of their own free will. They were, it was kind of an adventurous thing for them to do, is to leave their home country and come here and work on the railroad. They came of their own free will. They contracted with legitimate companies that they paid back their fare, as I was just saying, and it wasn't slave labor. And a lot of times that gets mixed up. There are other parts of the Western Hemisphere that did hire them as indentured or as slave labor, but not on the building of the railroad.
Okay, so with that important distinction in mind, what forms of discrimination did they face when they were here?
The racial inequality that was in American society at that time was pervasive. So this prejudice that they faced on the railroad just mirrored what was happening in American life at that time. White workers filled the supervisory positions and skilled occupations such as carpenters or blacksmiths. Chinese workers weren't really allowed to do that. They were paid less than their white counterparts by about 30%. The white workers were offered room and board. The Chinese workers were not. They paid for their own food. They also, they lived in tent cities that moved along with the railroad. All of that was provided for the white workers. So this is definitely a form of prejudice that was perpetrated against them. They were ordered to work day and night and as I said, live in the open in tents. And by many accounts, they weren't treated very well by their supervisors.
And then something else that the exhibit sort of makes explicit and focuses on is the idea that these Chinese railroad workers didn't just accept this form of discrimination, and they actively fought against it. So the sort of crux of that is the largest railroad strike of its time during construction in 1867. Can you walk us through that strike, what their demands were, and then ideally what eventually happened? Were they successful? Did they win?
Yes and no. How's that for an answer? Yeah, this is an episode in history that isn't talked about a lot. And a lot of times the Chinese railroad workers are treated as victims and not given agency in their own story. And I think that the strike shows how they knew exactly how valuable they were in building the railroad. And it was the largest strike that took place up to that point. And again, it's not something that we read about in our history books as being one of the largest strikes. So the strike happened, let's see, I want to get the date right here, June 24th, 1867. So the workers are getting through the Sierra and all the hard work of the Sierra. The Central Pacific, as we said before, is racing to get through and wanting to build more and more track because they know the Union Pacific is getting way, way ahead of them. And they're just getting over this most difficult part. And what happens? 3,000 workers lay down their tools and refuse to work. And it's amazing that they could cover that much territory with that many people and just stop working. And as I said before, they did this because they knew their worth. And they knew, you aren't going to get very far without us. What we want is we want to be paid equitably with the other workers. They knew they weren't being paid the same as the white workers, and they wanted shorter work days. They'd just been, and we'll probably talk about just the horrendous conditions that they were working under when they were working at the Summit area, but they've just been through this hellish experience, and they're working 10-hour shifts, 11-hour shifts. So they wanted shorter shifts and they wanted higher pay, and they put down their tools and they refused to work. Charles Crocker came along and he said, I will not negotiate with them, and didn't negotiate with them. So he cut off their food supply, and they could only hold out, the workers could only hold out for about a week until they had to give in because they didn't eat. They didn't have any food. So, I think for a long time, it was kind of looked at that, oh, well, they went on strike, but they lost because Charles Crocker wouldn't negotiate with them. But in truth, they did win because they showed that you better pay attention to us. We know that we are very important, and we can go elsewhere. There are a lot of people who want to hire us. And after that, very quietly, their pay was raised to the amount that they wanted. So they really did win, even though it kind of looked like they didn't.
Yeah, it sounds like it's like, okay, well, we can't officially have you win because that, even makes it look worse for us. It makes it look like the strikes are effective and things like that. So we'll give you what you want as long as you pretend like you lost, that kind of thing.
They defied the company.
Yeah.
And showed they couldn't be taken for granted, and that is a huge win.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting sort of potential legacy of the Central Pacific, because that is a pretty significant strike-busting measure. Like, these workers are in a place that maybe you would know this better than me, but it doesn't seem like they have very many options to leave if they say, oh, okay, the strike isn't going well, there's no more food, let's just head to the nearest city, right? Like, they can't take the train back to the major cities, so they kind of don't have a choice at some point, and that's...
Well, and we didn't talk about the food that the Chinese workers ate, but when I said that the railroad supplied food to the white workers, that was meat and potatoes. That's what their diet consisted of. The Chinese workers' diet consisted of vegetables and fresh meat, chicken, fish, all kinds of things. And so that food, for the most part, had to be imported in. So they couldn't, if that supply was cut off, then they didn't have the food that they wanted to eat.
Yeah, it's one of those, like you wouldn't see that necessarily today because there aren't very many places in which your employer provides, your housing, your path back to the rest of the world, as well as your food. And it just makes it very difficult to actually have a long and prolonged strike. So it's interesting they were still successful even with all those sort of things in their way. So talking a little bit, you mentioned there the difficulties in building through the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Can you tell our audience a little bit about why the Sierra Nevada mountain range is particularly hard to get through, and a little bit about eventually Summit Tunnel ends up being sort of the big finale, the thing that best encapsulates, I think, the struggle to get through the Sierras. If you can tell us
Right.
that story as
Yeah.
well.
And again, if you go back to looking at the geography of the land for the Union Pacific, who started in Nebraska, and they're building across the plains, which is flat, and building a railroad on flat land is the most desirable thing. Well, what happens in Sacramento, if you're not familiar with the geography here in California, but when you just get about an hour outside of Sacramento, you are hitting the foothills and then the Sierra Nevada mountain range, so which is a rise in elevation of about 7,000 feet. So it rises very quickly, and getting up and over that range is not the most desirable way for a train. So it was really hard work. Nature had to be shaped, cut, filled, packed, and bridged. And as we were saying before, it was hand labor. So they only had picks and shovels and wheelbarrows, carts, horses. That's what they had to do all of that work. They filled deep ravines, they used blasting powder, and literally moved thousands of tons of earth, gravel, and rock. And I just have to stop and think about that for a moment when you just think about the incredible work that they did. It was, it's amazing that they succeeded, right? So when they reached the Donner Summit, if you're not familiar with that, that's about 7,000 feet above sea level, named Donner Summit for the famous Donner Party that got stuck in the 1840s trying to get to California with a terrible winter. So Donner Summit is a very, very challenging place. And as you were saying, Jake, you talked about epitomizing that whole thing with this one tunnel. It was Tunnel 6, also known as Summit Tunnel. Up in the summit area, they had to build about 15 tunnels. So Summit Tunnel was the longest. It was 1,659 feet long. So just think about a football field. If you're standing on a football field and you're looking to the end, that's a pretty big thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, now take 5 of those football fields and stack them end to end, and that's how long Summit Tunnel was. It was through solid granite, and we're talking about just using hand tools to get through. It was also in the, having to work in the wintertime and the terrible cold of drilling through a mountain with hand tools, solid granite. So the railroad ran 24-hour shifts to get the work done. It was agonizingly slow. They used so many kegs of black powder in a day. And they also experimented with nitroglycerin to help speed up the work. Now, in order to make the work move more quickly, they were working from each end of the tunnel and working inward. It still took a long time. So they went to the top of the tunnel and they built a shaft down. They used a steam engine from a stripped-down locomotive that was hauled to the top of the tunnel, and then work crews set about sinking a vertical shaft 73 feet down the center of that tunnel. And then the workers were let down into the tunnel, and then they worked out both ways of that. So they actually then had 4 directions that they were able to work in, the east and west faces, and then once they were in that shaft, from the inside working out. And it took them about 18 months to complete that.
Absolutely. And what was it like? You mentioned a little bit there, the living and the working conditions. What would it have been like if you were, in one of those tent cities?
It just so happens that the winter of between 1866 and 1867, 1868 was one of the worst winters ever, kind of making you think of the Donner Party that got stuck in a terrible winter. There were, from November 1866 to May 1867, there were 44 snowstorms. So they had to tunnel through that granite, but work through 40-foot snow drifts. There was snow and landslides swept many of their camps away. They worked in blizzards and avalanches. I mean, I just can't even imagine what it must have been like for them. They built snow tunnels to get around him. They were more in cabins than tents in such extreme weather as that. But you know, you and I we were lucky enough to take a trip up there to the actual tunnels for one of our portscast. And when you're just standing in that tunnel and you just think about how difficult it must have been to just the noise and just being so closed in and the dust and everything that they had to deal with, with nothing but a lamp or maybe candlelight to even see by. And so it was terrible conditions to work in. We can't even imagine what it was like.
I'm sure once they got up and over the Sierras, I mean, you still had to deal with camp life and things like that, but once they got into the summers and past the Sierras, they all had like a nice little, like, okay, at least it's a little bit better than that.
It was, except then they had to go through the Humboldt desert and the extreme heat of that.
So just the opposite.
Yeah, just the opposite.
As soon as their blood started to thicken up, so they adapted to the summers in the Sierras, or the winters in the Sierras, then it's summer in a desert.
And you think about they're using all this hand labor, so they're using a metal bar. One man is holding that bar against the granite, and then someone else is pounding it with a sledgehammer. Well, if you're distracted or just one little anything happens, you've lost a finger or you've lost a hand, or then you're putting explosives in. And if something happens, like we really, when we were up there, we had to remember how many men actually gave their lives in the building of this railroad. And unfortunately, the records were not kept with individual names. So it's impossible to know exactly how many men actually did lose their lives building the railroad.
Thank you all for listening to this week's episode of Roundhouse Crosstalk, a podcast hosted by the California State Railroad Museum. We'll have the second part of this interview talking about what happened after they got through the Sierra Nevada mountain range and what happened after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad for these mini workers in our next episode, so stay tuned for that. If you'd like to learn more in the meantime, come visit us here at the California State Railroad Museum and see our exhibit on the Chinese railroad worker experience. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you next time.